On the morning of February 28, 2026, the people of Tehran woke up to a sound they had never heard before in their lifetimes. Not a distant rumble, not the sound of a passing thunderstorm. It was the unmistakable, gut-wrenching roar of precision airstrikes hitting the heart of their capital city. And within hours, the name of one man was on the lips of every geopolitical analyst, every intelligence officer, and every head of state on the planet. Not Benjamin Netanyahu. The name was Mohammed bin Salman. Because here's the truth that nobody in mainstream media is talking about. The war that you are watching unfold between the United States, Israel, and Iran did not begin on February 28, 2026. It began years earlier in the marble-floored palaces of Riyadh, in the private jets crossing between Washington and Saudi Arabia, and in the quiet back-channel phone calls between a crown prince who wanted Iran destroyed and the most powerful leaders in the Western world. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how Mohammed bin Salman engineered the most audacious geopolitical trap in modern history, how he used American military power, Israeli ambition, and Iranian miscalculation to do what Saudi Arabia could never have done alone, neutralize its greatest regional rival without firing a single Saudi missile. And the truly terrifying part? It worked. But the cost of that success may reshape the entire global economy for a generation. Stick with me, because what I'm about to show you goes far deeper than anything you have seen in the news. And right at the end, I'm going to reveal the one factor that every analyst is getting wrong about where this goes next. And it involves something in the Strait of Hormuz that could change the price of everything you buy, starting tomorrow. Let us go back to the beginning, not February 2026, the real beginning. For decades, Saudi Arabia and Iran have been locked in one of the most consequential rivalries in world history. This is not simply a religious conflict between Sunni and Shia Islam, though that dimension is real and significant. At its core, this is a battle for regional supremacy, a struggle over who controls the political, economic, and military destiny of the Middle East. And for most of that history, Iran held significant advantages. Iran has a population of roughly 90 million people, more than double that of Saudi Arabia. It has a battle-hardened military, forged through the Iran-Iraq War, through decades of proxy conflicts, and through the direct experience of asymmetric warfare that few nations in the world can match. Most importantly, Iran built something that Saudi Arabia could never replicate with oil money alone. A vast network of proxy forces stretching from the Houthi rebels in Yemen to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to the popular mobilization forces in Iraq, to Hamas in Gaza. This was Iran's great strategic achievement, the axis of resistance. A ring of armed, motivated, battle-tested groups that served as Iran's forward deterrent, projecting power and fear far beyond its own borders. Saudi Arabia looked at this network and understood something fundamental. You cannot outspend your way out of a missile pointed at your oil fields. And in September 2019, Iran proved that point with terrifying precision when drones and cruise missiles struck the Abqaiq oil processing facility in eastern Saudi Arabia, knocking out approximately 50% of the kingdom's oil production in a single night. Saudi air defenses, armed with some of the most expensive American equipment money could buy, failed to stop it. That night changed everything for Mohammed bin Salman. Here is what most people misunderstand about MBS. The Western media has painted him as a reckless, impulsive leader, a man who orders assassinations and starts wars on a whim. But that portrait is dangerously incomplete. MBS is, above all else, a strategic calculator. His entire domestic reform agenda, Vision 2030, the opening of Saudi society, the massive investment in sports and entertainment and tourism, all of it is driven by one cold, rational calculation. Saudi Arabia needs to transform itself before the oil money runs out, and it cannot transform itself if it is constantly under the shadow of Iranian missiles. Every entertainment venue he builds in Riyadh, every Formula One race he hosts, every tech company he tries to attract to Saudi soil, all of it becomes worthless if Iran can shut off his desalination plants with a drone swarm. The Abqaiq attack was not just a military humiliation, it was an economic warning, and MBS heard it loud and clear. So, beginning in 2020 and accelerating through 2021, 2022, and 2023, MBS began to execute a strategy of extraordinary complexity. On the surface, he was presenting himself as a pragmatist, a leader willing to make peace. In March 2023, in a diplomatic development that shocked the world, Saudi Arabia and Iran signed a normalization agreement brokered by China, reopening embassies and pledging to reduce tensions. The Western press celebrated it as a sign of MBS maturing as a statesman. And on one level, it was. But here is what those celebratory editorials missed. MBS was not making peace with Iran because he trusted Iran. He was buying time. He was reducing the immediate threat to his economic transformation project while simultaneously working a completely different angle, cultivating the United States and Israel as the instruments of a final reckoning with Tehran that he himself could never publicly advocate for without destroying Saudi Arabia's standing in the Arab and Muslim world. And to understand why MBS believed this moment was achievable, why he thought 2025 and 2026 represented the optimal window for this operation, you need to understand what had happened to Iran's strategic position in the 2 years before the war. Between 2023 and 2025, Israel had systematically dismantled the most capable components of Iran's axis of resistance. Hamas in Gaza had been degraded as a military force. Hezbollah in Lebanon had lost several of its most senior military commanders, including Hassan Nasrallah himself, in a series of devastating Israeli strikes. The 2025 12-day war between Israel and Iran had already struck Iran's nuclear facilities once, setting the program back significantly. Assad's regime in Syria, a critical node in the Iranian proxy network, had fallen to rebel forces. And inside Iran, the economic situation was dire. Inflation was crushing the middle class, protests were spreading, the regime's legitimacy was at its lowest point in years. MBS looked at this landscape and saw something that few analysts articulated clearly at the time. Iran had never been weaker since the early years of the Islamic Republic, and the United States, under Trump, had never been more willing to use military force. The window was open. And MBS intended to make sure it did not close before someone walked through it. To understand how this worked, you need to understand the financial architecture that MBS constructed around the Trump administration. This is not speculation. This is documented, reported, and verifiable. The Saudi Public Investment Fund, the sovereign wealth fund that MBS personally chairs, made a $2 billion investment in Affinity Partners, the private equity firm founded by Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law. The PIF's own internal review committee had recommended rejecting Kushner's proposal, citing his inexperience and what they described as excessive fees. MBS overruled them personally. Why would the most powerful man in Saudi Arabia override his own financial analysts to give $2 billion to a firm that his own experts said was not worth it? The answer has nothing to do with expected financial returns. It has everything to do with political access. Kushner is not just a businessman, he is a direct line to Donald Trump. And through Kushner, MBS purchased something far more valuable than any return on investment. He purchased influence over the foreign policy decision-making of the United States of America. The numbers are staggering when you look at them clearly. The Senate Finance Committee estimated that Kushner's firm would collect approximately $137 million in management fees from the Saudi investment alone by August 2026. Meanwhile, the UAE, Saudi Arabia's close Gulf partner and fellow Iran hawk, invested an additional $200 million with Affinity Partners. And separately, the UAE's national security advisor purchased nearly half of the Trump-linked crypto firm World Liberty Financial, just days before Trump's inauguration, with approximately $187 million from that transaction flowing directly to Trump family entities. When you map out these financial relationships, a picture emerges that is almost too audacious to believe. The two Gulf states most threatened by Iran had, through perfectly legal financial investments, created a web of economic interest that bound the Trump family's financial future to the foreign policy objectives of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. And then the phone calls began. According to multiple reports from the Washington Post and other major outlets in the weeks and months leading up to February 28, 2026, MBS was on the phone with Trump and with senior administration officials, making the case for military action against Iran. His argument was straightforward. Iran was on the verge of a nuclear weapon. Its missile arsenal was growing. Its proxy network, though weakened by Israeli strikes in 2024 and 2025, was rebuilding. The window to act was closing, and MBS had specific intelligence, shared through Saudi channels, about the state of Iran's nuclear and missile programs. Was this intelligence accurate? Was it shaped and presented in a way designed to maximize its impact on a Trump administration already predisposed to hawkishness toward Iran? Those are questions that historians will debate for decades. What we know is that it worked. But here is where the strategy becomes truly masterful and truly ruthless. Even as MBS was privately lobbying Washington for strikes on Iran, he was making a completely separate set of calls to Tehran. In January 2026, as American and Israeli threats against Iran were intensifying, MBS personally called Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. The content of that call has not been fully disclosed, but Iranian officials later described it as a reassuring conversation. MBS expressing his desire for peace and stability, his opposition to any military escalation, his commitment to the 2023 normalization agreement. At the same time, MBS's brother, Defense Minister Prince Khalid bin Salman, was in Washington for meetings with Pentagon officials. The message from Riyadh to Washington was entirely different. The kingdom supports American strength in the region. The kingdom is concerned about Iranian capabilities. The kingdom is a reliable partner. This is what scholars of diplomacy call a two-track strategy. But calling it that, almost undersells it. MBS was simultaneously reassuring his enemy that the attack was not coming, while ensuring to the people launching the attack that the target was sufficiently distracted and unprepared. Whether you call that brilliant or ruthless depends entirely on your perspective. What you cannot call it is accidental. On February 28, 2026, at approximately 2 hours in the morning Tehran time, the United States and Israel launched what they would call Operation Epic Fury. Within hours, the world woke up to a conflict of a scale that nobody outside a small circle of planners had anticipated. U.S. forces had spent months, possibly years, mapping Iranian military infrastructure with extraordinary precision. In the opening hours of the operation, American B-2 bombers, launched from bases including Diego Garcia and the continental United States, dropped bunker-busting munitions on Iran's most deeply buried nuclear and missile facilities. Simultaneously, Israeli F-35 jets, refueled over Saudi airspace that Riyadh quietly made available, struck command centers, air defense installations, and senior leadership targets in and around Tehran. And in the most strategically significant strike of the opening salvo, a U.S.-Israeli joint operation killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had led the Islamic Republic for 34 years, the man who was the ideological backbone of the axis of resistance, the man whose network of proxies had reshaped the Middle East, was gone, within hours of the strike's beginning. The initial military effectiveness was overwhelming. Israeli military commanders announced that within the first week, their forces had destroyed approximately 80% of Iran's air defense network and at least 60% of its long-range missile launch capability. U.S. Central Command reported striking nearly 2,000 targets in Iran in the first 4 days alone. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of Washington's most respected defense think tanks, calculated the cost of the first 100 hours of Operation Epic Fury at $3.7 billion, roughly $891 million per day. And the vast majority of that cost, more than $3.5 billion, had not been budgeted for. The United States had launched a war that its own Congress had not voted for, had not fully funded, and had not debated. Now, here is where the story shifts from the military dimension to something far more consequential for the global economy, and for every person watching this video, regardless of where you live. Because what happened next in the Gulf was not just a regional military escalation, it was the opening act of an economic crisis that analysts are already comparing to the worst supply shocks in modern history. Iran, facing an existential assault on its government, its military, and its nuclear program, did exactly what it had promised to do for years. It hit back, hard. And it hit everywhere. Within 24 hours of the first American strikes, Iranian ballistic missiles and drones began raining down on 9 countries simultaneously. Not just Israel, which had been anticipated, but the Gulf states hosting American military bases: Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, Oman, and beyond. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Iran fired over 500 ballistic and naval missiles in the first 4 days. It launched approximately 2,000 drones. Roughly 40% of those were aimed at Israel. Roughly 60% were aimed at U.S. military targets across the region, and at the civilian and economic infrastructure of the Gulf states that Iran blamed for enabling the attack. Dubai was struck. Abu Dhabi was struck. Doha was struck. Riyadh was struck. The U.S. Embassy in Kuwait was hit and closed indefinitely. Iranian ballistic missiles landed on Saudi soil for the first time in modern history. The eastern province, home to the kingdom's most critical oil infrastructure, the King Abdulaziz Air Base, and the processing facilities through which a significant fraction of the world's oil flows every single day, was directly targeted. Saudi Arabia's official statement claimed no casualties, but the message was unmistakable. Iran was willing to burn the Gulf to the ground on its way down. And then Iran did something that every global energy market had dreaded for 4 decades. A senior IRGC official announced that Iranian forces would set fire to any ship attempting to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz. 17 miles wide at its narrowest point, the single most important choke point in the global energy system. Every single day, between 17 and 20 million barrels of oil pass through that strait, roughly 30% of all the oil traded by sea in the entire world. Qatar, the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, ships its product through the Strait of Hormuz. The UAE ships through it, Saudi Arabia ships through it, Kuwait ships through it. And the moment an IRGC commander threatened to close it, the moment Iranian forces began targeting tankers in the Gulf, the global energy market went into a full-scale panic. Oil prices surged to their highest level since September 2023. A U.S.-flagged tanker called the Stena Imperative was struck. A Honduras-flagged tanker called the Ate Nova was struck. Insurance rates for vessels transiting the Gulf spiked to levels that made commercial shipping economically catastrophic. major shipping companies began diverting routes around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and enormous additional cost to every energy shipment. The Strait of Hormuz had not been fully closed, but it did not need to be. The mere credible threat of closure was enough to send shockwaves through every commodity market on Earth. But before we get to the tanker fires and the energy markets, there's one more piece of the military picture from those opening hours that deserves your full attention. Because the scale of what Iran launched in retaliation, the 500 missiles, the 2,000 drones spread across 9 countries simultaneously, was not just a military response. It was a message written in fire and sent to every government in the region that had cooperated with, enabled, or simply failed to prevent the American and Israeli attack. Iran was telling the Gulf states, you opened your airspace, you hosted the planes, you provided the logistics, and you will pay a price for that. Every country that had quietly cooperated with the U.S. military presence in the Gulf, every government that had allowed American air defense systems to operate from its territory, every leadership that had signed status of forces agreements giving U.S. troops access to its bases, found itself under Iranian missile and drone attack within 48 hours of the opening strikes. This was Iran's version of deterrence. Not deterrence that prevented the war. That ship had sailed. But deterrence designed to prevent the next war. A brutal, undeniable demonstration that the cost of hosting American military power is not abstract. It is ballistic. It falls on your airports, your oil fields, your desalination plants, and your capital cities. Let us pause here and make sure you understand what this means in terms that go beyond abstract geopolitics. Because this is where the Iran war stops being a story about missiles and generals, and starts being a story about your electricity bill, your grocery prices, your fuel costs, and the value of the money in your bank account. The global economy runs on energy. Every product that is manufactured, every piece of food that is grown and transported, every service that requires electricity or logistics, all of it is priced in relation to the cost of energy. When the price of oil spikes dramatically, as it did in the hours and days after the Strait of Hormuz threat, it does not just make gasoline more expensive at the pump. It creates an inflationary wave that moves through the entire economy like a slow-motion shockwave. Manufacturers pay more for inputs. Shipping companies charge more for delivery. Grocery stores pass higher costs to consumers. Central banks face an impossible dilemma. Do they raise interest rates to fight the inflation, potentially triggering a recession? Or do they hold rates steady and allow prices to spiral? There is no good answer to that question. And behind all of it, driving every pricing decision, every investment choice, every political calculation, is the question of whether that 17-mile-wide waterway in the Persian Gulf stays open or closes. The stock markets reflected this terror in real time. Global equity indices fell sharply in the opening days of the conflict. Defense stocks soared. Companies making missile interceptors, drone systems, and military electronics saw extraordinary gains. But the broader market moved deeply into risk-off territory. Investors who had spent years building carefully diversified portfolios found themselves exposed to a geopolitical risk that no financial model had adequately priced in. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, institutional investors, all of them were recalculating exposure to energy markets, to Gulf-linked assets, to anything that touched the supply chains running through the Middle East. The stock markets reflected this terror in real time. Global equity indices fell sharply in the opening days of the conflict. Defense stocks soared. Companies making missile interceptors, drone systems, and military electronics saw extraordinary gains. But the broader market moved deeply into risk-off territory. Investors who had spent years building carefully diversified portfolios found themselves exposed to a geopolitical risk that no financial model had adequately priced in. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, institutional investors, all of them were recalculating exposure to energy markets, to Gulf-linked assets, to anything that touched the supply chains running through the Middle East. Think about what this means for the average person on the street, not just the institutional investor in a glass tower. When global shipping insurance premiums triple overnight because insurers are being asked to cover vessels transiting a potential war zone, those costs do not disappear. They are passed on. They flow through the supply chain like water through a cracked pipe, eventually reaching the consumer in the form of higher prices on fuel, on food, on electricity, on goods that were manufactured in Asia using Gulf energy and shipped through Gulf waters. The inflation that results is not a choice any central bank makes. It is a mathematical consequence of a physical reality. The reality that 30% of the world's seaborne oil passes through a strait that is now being actively threatened by a nation at war. And here's the element that makes this crisis particularly dangerous for the global economy in a way that previous Middle East conflicts did not. The world is far more interconnected today than it was during the 1973 oil embargo or the Gulf War of 1991. Supply chains are global, just-in-time, and extraordinarily fragile. A prolonged disruption to Gulf energy flows would not just raise oil prices, It would create cascading failures across manufacturing, agriculture, technology, and finance in ways that are genuinely difficult to predict and potentially very difficult to reverse. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi summed it up publicly when he warned that his country, dependent on the Suez Canal revenue and on energy imports, was already in a state of near economic emergency. And Egypt is not even in the Gulf. It is not hosting U.S. military bases. It is not being directly struck by Iranian missiles. Yet the ripple effects of this conflict were already reaching Cairo within days of its starting. Imagine what they were doing to countries in Asia, to Japan, South Korea, India, and China, which import massive quantities of Gulf energy and whose entire economic models depend on the continued, uninterrupted flow of oil and gas through waters that were now, suddenly, a war zone. India received a special mention in the economic dimension of this crisis. The United States issued a waiver allowing India to continue purchasing Russian crude oil, a recognition that forcing India to stop buying discounted Russian energy in the middle of a Gulf supply crisis would be economically catastrophic for New Delhi and potentially push India further toward Moscow at precisely the moment when Washington needed Asian allies to remain engaged and supportive. This single diplomatic footnote reveals the extraordinary complexity of managing a major Middle East war in a multipolar world. Every decision made in Washington about military operations in Iran carries simultaneous economic and diplomatic implications for relationships thousands of miles away. Now, let us come back to Saudi Arabia, because this is where the narrative takes one of its most remarkable turns. Remember what we established at the beginning of this analysis. MBS did not want this war, or rather, he wanted the outcome of this war, but he did not want Saudi Arabia to be caught in the crossfire. His entire Vision 2030 economic transformation program depends on Saudi Arabia being perceived as a safe, stable, investable destination. Neom, the futuristic city being built in the desert, the entertainment venues, the Formula One races, the golf tournaments, the tourist resorts on the Red Sea coast, all of that brand equity, everything MBS has spent years and hundreds of billions of dollars building, requires a Saudi Arabia that is free from the threat of Iranian missiles over Riyadh. The moment Iranian ballistic missiles actually struck Saudi soil on February 28, 2026, MBS faced the most acute crisis of his political career. Not because he had not anticipated it, he had. His intelligence services had wargamed exactly this scenario. But anticipating a crisis and living through it are two very different things. 7 million people live in Riyadh. Many of them had never experienced a missile attack in their lives. The psychological and political impact of hearing Iranian missiles over the Saudi capital was immense. And MBS knew that how he responded in the next 48 hours would define his reign. His response was, and this must be acknowledged as a masterclass in crisis communication, perfectly calibrated. The Saudi Foreign Ministry issued a statement within hours that condemned what it called the blatant and cowardly Iranian attacks, reserved the right to respond with force, and simultaneously called on all parties to end the spiral of violence, explicitly acknowledging that the United States and Israel had started the conflict. It was a statement that simultaneously satisfied Washington by showing solidarity, satisfied the Saudi public by showing strength, and preserved Saudi Arabia's standing in the wider Arab and Muslim world by not giving the Americans and Israelis a blank check. MBS was condemning the Iranian response to the very war he had privately helped engineer. The audacity of it is almost breathtaking. And at the same moment, according to Middleeast Eye, MBS was on the phone with the leaders of Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, not urging them to escalate, but counseling restraint, arguing that the Gulf states needed to absorb the Iranian strikes without retaliating, to preserve the diplomatic space for an eventual ceasefire. He was playing every side simultaneously. He was the victim, the statesman, the warrior, and the peacemaker, all at once. Meanwhile, the UK entered the conflict in a way that added another dimension of strategic complexity. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, after days of pressure from both Trump and opposition leader Kemi Badenoch, granted permission for the United States to use Royal Air Force bases, including RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire, for operations against Iranian missile sites. A 146-foot B-1 Lancer bomber landed at Fairford, making the UK a direct participant in the conflict for the first time. Iran's UN ambassador responded by warning that his country would take all necessary measures to defend itself, and that Iranian forces had already struck a UK military base in Cyprus. The circle of nations directly involved in this conflict was expanding with every passing hour. Ukraine offered its own remarkable subplot. President Volodymyr Zelensky, never one to miss a diplomatic opportunity, called MBS and the leaders of multiple Gulf states to offer Ukraine's unique expertise in intercepting Iranian Shahed drones. Ukraine's logic was elegant. Ukrainian forces had been fighting against Shahed 136 drones for years, developing low-cost interception techniques using small, cheap drones that cost between $1,000 and $2,000, compared to the millions of dollars that each Patriot missile interceptor costs. While the Gulf states were burning through their most expensive missile interceptors at a rate that was beginning to strain their inventories, Zelensky was offering a cheaper, battle-tested alternative. U.S. President Trump said he would welcome assistance from any country. And just like that, the Russia-Ukraine war and the Iran-US-Israel war became connected. Two separate conflicts sharing a common weapon system, a common threat, and now potentially a common solution. Let us now look at what the opening 9 days of Operation Epic Fury actually achieved in military terms, because understanding the military picture is essential to understanding the economic and geopolitical picture. On the positive side, for the US-Israel coalition, by day 7, Israeli military commanders claimed that 80% of Iran's air defense network had been destroyed. 60% of Iran's long-range missile launch capability had been degraded. Hundreds of command and control nodes had been struck. The nuclear program, which had already been set back by strikes in June 2025, was being systematically dismantled again. Iran's supreme leader was dead. Iran's ability to launch coordinated large-scale missile strikes was declining daily, with ballistic missile attacks dropping 90% and drone attacks falling 83% from the first day to day 7. By any conventional military metric, the opening phase of the campaign was extraordinarily successful. The US and Israel had done in 9 days what military planners had theorized might take months. But here is the question that the generals cannot answer, and that the financial markets are desperately trying to price: what comes next? Because military victory and strategic victory are not the same thing. Destroying Iran's missile arsenal does not automatically produce a stable, friendly government in Tehran. Trump's demand for unconditional surrender was met almost immediately with defiance from Iran's foreign minister, who rejected the idea of a ceasefire or new negotiations and stated that Iran was prepared even for the possibility of a U.S. ground invasion. Iran's Security Council Secretary Ali Larijani issued a stark warning that Iranian forces were waiting for a potential U.S. ground invasion and had prepared measures to kill and capture thousands of U.S. troops. The Iranian population, rather than uniformly celebrating the removal of the regime that had suppressed them, was deeply divided, some taking to the streets in anti-government protests, others rallying in nationalist solidarity against a foreign military attack on their homeland. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the Iranian people directly in Farsi, urging them in his words to come out in millions to overthrow the regime of fear. But multiple experts pointed out that Iranians rallying against a foreign attacker and Iranians rallying for democracy are not the same people making the same choice. The history of external military interventions aimed at producing internal regime change is not encouraging. And the vision of a stable, democratic, pro-Western Iran emerging from the rubble of Tehran in the near term was one that even some of Israel's own analysts described as, in the words of former Israeli government advisor Daniel Levy, a kind of fairy tale. Trump characteristically offered his own framework. He announced that Iran had a great future waiting for it, that once it surrendered unconditionally, the United States and its allies would help rebuild the country's shattered economy and make it bigger and stronger than ever before. He also announced, with remarkable directness, that he intended to play a role in selecting Iran's next leader, explicitly calling Mojtaba Khamenei, the late Supreme Leader's son and one leading candidate for succession, an unacceptable choice. The extraordinary spectacle of an American president publicly interviewing candidates for the leadership of a sovereign nation of 90 million people was noted with alarm by governments from Beijing to Brussels. China, which had brokered the 2023 Saudi-Iran normalization deal and had significant economic interests in Iranian energy, issued carefully worded calls for restraint without taking any concrete action. Russia, deeply involved in its own war in Ukraine, was watching carefully. Analysts noted that the Iran conflict might benefit Moscow if American weapons and attention that might have gone to Ukraine were now being diverted to the Middle East. Europe was divided and largely paralyzed. Governments in Berlin, Paris, and Rome calling for diplomacy while lacking any real leverage to enforce it. The United Nations declared the conflict a major humanitarian emergency alongside the simultaneous Afghanistan-Pakistan war. But the Security Council remained gridlocked with Russia and China effectively blocking any decisive collective action. And so the world arrived at a moment that no spreadsheet, no economic model, and no geopolitical framework had fully anticipated, a moment in which the United States was engaged in a full-scale military campaign in Iran, the Strait of Hormuz was under threat, the Gulf states were absorbing Iranian missile strikes, the global economy was absorbing an oil price shock, and the question of what happens on the other side of all of this had no clear answer. Let us now return to the man at the center of it all, because here is the final and most important layer of the MBS story. And it is the one that connects everything we have discussed into a single, coherent, strategic vision. Mohammed bin Salman did not set this trap because he wanted chaos. He set it because he wanted order, on his terms, in his timeline. The scenario that MBS always feared was not a war. It was a war in which Saudi Arabia was the primary target. What he engineered, if the reporting is accurate, is a war in which American and Israeli military power does the heavy lifting of dismantling Iran's capability, while Saudi Arabia plays the role of victim statesman, preserving its relationships with Washington, with Beijing, with Tehran's potential successor government, and with the broader Arab world all at once. If it works, if Iran's military is genuinely degraded, if a more pragmatic Iranian government eventually emerges, if the Strait of Hormuz reopens and energy markets stabilize, then MBS will have achieved in a matter of weeks what generations of Saudi strategists considered impossible: the structural defanging of Saudi Arabia's most dangerous rival, at zero direct cost to Riyadh in military terms, and with Saudi Arabia positioned to lead the reconstruction of both Iran and the broader regional order in the aftermath. That is the bet. And it is a bet of breathtaking ambition. But, and this is the part that the Saudi Crown Prince's war room understands very clearly, it is also a bet that could go catastrophically wrong in multiple ways simultaneously. What if Iran does not collapse? What if the regime holds together under the pressure of foreign attack, as historical precedent suggests is quite possible? What if Iranian missiles keep flying and Saudi desalination plants, the facilities that provide drinking water to millions of Saudi citizens, are struck and severely damaged? What if the Strait of Hormuz is not just threatened, but actually closed for an extended period, setting oil prices to levels that crash the global economy and dry up the investment flows that Vision 2030 depends on? What if the U.S., exhausted and domestically divided, pulls back before Iran is truly neutralized, leaving a wounded and enraged Iran facing a Saudi Arabia that it knows was complicit in the attack? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the scenarios that keep every serious analyst awake at night, because the history of the Middle East is littered with brilliant strategic plans that survived first contact with the enemy and then unraveled in ways their architects never predicted. The economic dimension of that risk cannot be overstated. Saudi Arabia's entire post-oil future depends on a specific set of conditions: stable energy markets that keep government revenues flowing during the transition period, a security environment that makes international investors comfortable placing capital in the kingdom, and a regional diplomatic posture that keeps Saudi Arabia from being drawn into direct military confrontation with adversaries it cannot defeat alone. The Iran war threatens all three of those conditions simultaneously. Saudi Arabia's 2026 defense budget of $78 billion, representing 21% of total government spending, reveals both the kingdom's seriousness about security and the extraordinary burden that sustained conflict places on its economic transformation agenda. Every rial spent on missile defense is a rial not spent on NEOM. Every investor who pauses to assess Gulf security risk is a partner that does not sign an agreement with Saudi Aramco or the Public Investment Fund. The war premium that attaches to Gulf assets when Iranian missiles are flying over Riyadh is not an abstraction. It is a real cost, measured in basis points and deal flows and capital allocations, that compounds over time and makes MBS's 2030 targets harder to reach with every passing week of conflict. And there is one more actor in this story who deserves careful attention, because their choices will do more to determine the final outcome than any military strike or diplomatic cable. That actor is the Iranian people themselves, 90 million of them. A civilization with 3,000 years of history, a population that has survived the Iran-Iraq war, international sanctions, economic mismanagement, and political repression, and has demonstrated repeatedly that it is capable of extraordinary resilience. The Western assumption, baked into Trump's Truth Social posts and Netanyahu's Farsi language broadcasts, that Iranians are simply waiting to be liberated by American and Israeli bombs, is not supported by any serious understanding of Iranian political culture. Yes, there were massive protests in Iran in early 2026, driven by economic desperation and political frustration. Yes, some Iranians welcomed the weakening of the regime, but many others, including Iranians who despise the Islamic Republic, were outraged by the killing of Khamenei, by the strikes on civilian areas, by the deaths of more than 1,000 of their fellow citizens, including children in schools. The nationalism that foreign attacks tend to generate in civilian populations is a powerful and historically consistent force. And an Iran that emerges from this conflict without a clear successor government, without stability, with millions of displaced and traumatized citizens, and with its military infrastructure destroyed but its territorial integrity intact. That Iran could become something even more dangerous than the Iran that existed before February 28, 2026. And there is one more actor in this story who deserves careful attention, because their choices will do more to determine the final outcome than any military strike or diplomatic cable. That actor is the Iranian people themselves, 90 million of them, a civilization with 3,000 years of history. A population that has survived the Iran-Iraq war, international sanctions, economic mismanagement, and political repression, and has demonstrated repeatedly that it is capable of extraordinary resilience. The Western assumption, baked into Trump's Truth Social posts and Netanyahu's Farsi language broadcasts, that Iranians are simply waiting to be liberated by American and Israeli bombs, is not supported by any serious understanding of Iranian political culture. Yes, there were massive protests in Iran in early 2026, driven by economic desperation and political frustration. Yes, some Iranians welcomed the weakening of the regime, but many others, including Iranians who despise the Islamic Republic, were outraged by the killing of Khamenei, by the strikes on civilian areas, by the deaths of more than 1,000 of their fellow citizens, including children in schools. The nationalism that foreign attacks tend to generate in civilian populations is a powerful and historically consistent force. And an Iran that emerges from this conflict without a clear successor government, without stability, with millions of displaced and traumatized citizens, and with its military infrastructure destroyed but its territorial integrity intact, that Iran could become something even more dangerous than the Iran that existed before February 28, 2026. Consider the history. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, it dismantled a military regime in 3 weeks of combat. What followed was a decade of insurgency, civil war, sectarian conflict, the rise of ISIS, and a regional destabilization that is still reverberating 20 years later. When NATO intervened in Libya in 2011, Muammar Gaddafi's regime collapsed within months. What followed was a decade and a half of civil war, a failed state, a human trafficking crisis on the Mediterranean, and a power vacuum that was filled by competing militias, foreign powers, and armed extremist groups. The pattern of external military intervention producing rapid regime change followed by prolonged instability is not an exception in modern geopolitical history. It is the rule, and if that pattern holds in Iran, a country with 4 times Iraq's population, a far more sophisticated political culture, significant regional influence even in its weakened state, and a nuclear program whose remnants and expertise do not disappear even if the physical infrastructure is destroyed, then the post-war landscape could be far more complex and dangerous than anyone in Washington or Tel Aviv is publicly acknowledging. There's also the Lebanon dimension. Israel, in parallel with its operations in Iran, was conducting intensive strikes on Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah positions and infrastructure. Hundreds of thousands of Lebanese civilians were displaced. The Lebanese government, trying to thread an impossible needle between Hezbollah's domestic political power and the Lebanese state's desperate desire to stay out of another war, announced it would ban Hezbollah's military activities and demanded the group hand over its weapons. Hezbollah had previously said it would only disarm if Israel fully withdrew from Lebanon, a condition Israel showed no sign of meeting. And the UN's human rights chief was warning that Lebanon risked becoming a key flashpoint in a conflict that was already consuming the wider region. The Houthis in Yemen, meanwhile, were taking the remarkable step of restraint, condemning the attack on Iran in words but declining to resume missile attacks on Red Sea shipping, apparently calculating that they could not afford to open another front while Yemen's civil war remained unresolved. This careful Houthi restraint was itself a strategic signal. The axis of resistance was fragmenting under the pressure of sustained military degradation and strategic uncertainty. So where does this leave us? Where does all of this lead? The honest answer, the answer that any serious analyst must give it, is that we do not know. We are 9 days into a conflict whose trajectory is genuinely uncertain. The scenarios range from an Iranian regime collapse and a negotiated transition that reshapes the Middle East in a generation, all the way to a prolonged war of attrition that destabilizes the global economy, exhausts American military resources, creates a political backlash in the United States that ends the conflict on ambiguous terms, and leaves a wounded, radicalized Iran seeking revenge for decades to come. The gap between those scenarios is vast, and in that gap, in that uncertainty, lies the greatest geopolitical and economic risk of our time. But here is what we can say with confidence. The world of February 27th, 2026, the world that existed the night before the first American bombs fell on Tehran, is gone. The axis of resistance that Iran spent 40 years building is severely weakened. The question of Iranian nuclear capability, which dominated global diplomacy for 2 decades, has been answered militarily in a way that treaties and negotiations never resolved. The role of Saudi Arabia as a regional power has been permanently elevated. Whether MBS intended it or not, the kingdom is now the central surviving regional actor, the nation that absorbed Iranian missiles without being destroyed, the state that preserved its relationships with every major power simultaneously, and the economy that, if the conflict concludes favorably, stands to benefit most from the reconstruction of the Gulf Order. The global energy system has been reminded, in the most visceral possible way, that its dependence on a 17-mile-wide waterway in the Persian Gulf is not a theoretical vulnerability. It is a real one, and the reckoning that produces the accelerated push toward energy diversification, the recalculation of supply chain geography, the repricing of geopolitical risk across every asset class will shape investment decisions, political choices, and economic outcomes for years, possibly decades to come. And Mohammed bin Salman, the man who may have done more than any other single individual to bring this moment into being, sits in Riyadh, watching the results of his gamble unfold in real time. He is 50 years old. He has decades of power ahead of him, assuming the kingdom remains stable. He has staked his legacy, his economic transformation project, and the future of his dynasty on the bet that America and Israel would do what Saudi Arabia could not do alone, that they would remove the Iranian threat at their cost, in their blood and treasure, and that Riyadh would emerge on the other side stronger, safer, and more central to the new Middle Eastern order than at any point in modern history. Whether that bet pays off, whether history records MBS as the shrewdest strategic mind of his generation, or as the man whose miscalculation triggered a catastrophe he could not control, remains to be written. What has already been written, in the smoke rising over Tehran, in the missile fragments scattered across Riyadh, in the tanker fires burning in the Gulf of Oman, in the trading floors of London and New York and Shanghai, where oil prices are being repriced in real time, is the opening chapter of a story that will define this decade, and perhaps the century that follows it. This is not just a Middle East story. This is not just a war between countries that are far away from where you live. This is a story about who controls the energy that powers the global economy, about who sits at the center of the financial architecture that connects the world's wealth, about whether the rules-based international order that has governed global affairs since 1945 can survive the kind of raw, unapologetic power politics that we are watching unfold in real time, and about whether one man, a crown prince sitting in a palace in Riyadh, playing chess with the fates of nations, was brilliant enough to make the most dangerous gamble in modern geopolitical history pay off. The answer is coming. We are all watching it arrive. Let us also consider what this conflict reveals about the nature of power in the 21st century, because there is a lesson here that goes far beyond the immediate crisis. For most of the post-Cold War era, we operated under the assumption that power derived from one of two sources: military capability or economic size. The United States had both. China was building both. Russia was trying to maintain both. And smaller nations, nations like Saudi Arabia, Israel, the UAE, were assumed to operate within the strategic space that the great powers defined for them. What MBS appears to have demonstrated, if the analysis of his role in engineering this conflict is accurate, is that a third form of power has emerged in the 21st century: the power of financial entanglement. The power of making yourself so economically indispensable to the decision makers of great powers that you can effectively shape their strategic choices without ever deploying your own military force. Saudi Arabia did not need to bomb Iran. It needed to fund the right people, invite the right investments, host the right conversations, and ensure that the financial interests of those who control American foreign policy were aligned with Saudi Arabia's strategic objectives. If that is what happened here, and again, the financial relationships are documented and the private lobbying is reported, then the implications for how we think about international relations are profound, because it means that the era of purely military deterrence is over. It means that financial architecture is now as strategically important as military architecture. And it means that the battles of the 21st century will be fought not just with missiles and drones, but with investment funds, cryptocurrency stakes, real estate deals, and the quiet, persistent cultivation of financial dependencies in the capitals of the world's most powerful nations. This is not a comfortable thought. It is a deeply unsettling one, because financial influence of this kind operates in the shadows. It is hard to see, hard to regulate, and hard to hold accountable through the normal mechanisms of democratic oversight. The American Congress did not vote for the Iran war. The American public was not fully consulted. And yet the war happened, launched by an executive who had deep and well-documented financial ties to the governments that stood most directly to benefit from it. Whether that constitutes the corruption of democratic foreign policy making or simply the normal operation of great power interests is a debate that democratic societies are going to be forced to have, loudly and urgently, in the months and years ahead. If you want to stay ahead of this story, if you want to understand not just what is happening, but why it is happening and what comes next, make sure you follow this channel, because we are going to continue tracking every development in this conflict, every economic signal, every diplomatic move, and every strategic shift as they unfold. The world is changing faster right now than at any point in a generation. And understanding how it is changing is the most important thing any of us can do. The Strait of Hormuz is still technically open as of today. Whether it stays that way, and what happens to the global economy if it does not, is the question that should be on everyone's mind. We will be here to help you make sense of it. One final thought before we close. There's a dimension of this story that almost nobody in the Western press is discussing, and it may ultimately prove to be the most consequential of all. It is the question of what this conflict does to the credibility of the global non-proliferation system. For 3 decades, the international community has operated on the assumption that the most effective way to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons is through diplomacy, inspection regimes, multilateral agreements, and economic sanctions. The JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran that was negotiated in 2015 and then abandoned by Trump in 2018, was the centerpiece of that approach. It was imperfect. It was limited in scope. Its critics argued, with genuine substance, that it delayed rather than permanently resolved the Iranian nuclear question. But it represented the best available multilateral framework for managing one of the most dangerous proliferation challenges the world had ever faced. What happens to that framework now? What message does every other country in the world, every government that is watching the Iran conflict and drawing its own conclusions, take from the fact that Iran's nuclear program was ultimately not resolved through diplomacy, but destroyed through military force? The message is not comfortable. The message is, if you want to deter the United States and Israel from attacking you, you need to have a nuclear weapon before they decide to strike. Not after. Before. The North Korean leadership is watching. Whatever remains of Iran's nuclear knowledge and expertise is dispersed, and that expertise does not disappear when buildings are bombed. It lives in the minds of scientists who will eventually find new patrons, new states, new programs. The long-term proliferation consequences of the Iran war, the signal it sends about the futility of negotiated disarmament without security guarantees, could haunt the world long after the immediate conflict is over. That is the darkest possible reading of where we are. And it deserves to be said, clearly and directly, alongside every other dimension of this extraordinary, terrifying, world-altering moment in history, we are living through events that future generations will study for centuries. Make sure you understand them.